The taste of recycled air and fear still lingers when I remember that sealed vault beneath the Tower of Hegemon on Terra. My name is Archivist Tertius Valdris, keeper of the Forbidden Records, and what I discovered in Archive Sublevel Omega would have me executed for heresy if the wrong ears heard this testimony. 20 years ago, Games Workshop's design team created something they weren't supposed to. A Space Marine chapter that revealed truths the Imperium desperately wanted buried. The Steel Confessors weren't just another failed product line or marketing mistake. They were a glimpse behind the curtain of Imperial propaganda, showing the galaxy what Space Marines really became when faith and duty collided with impossible choices. You think this makes me a conspiracy theorist spreading rumors about corporate decisions, but you don't know what those models contained. Hidden lore fragments that contradicted decades of established canon and revealed secrets that could shatter the very foundation of how we understand the Adeptus Astartes. Chapter 1. The Forbidden Archive. The morning I first encountered evidence of the Steel Confessors began like any other day in the depths of Terra's archival complexes. I had spent 7 years cataloguing rejected design concepts, cancelled product lines, and abandoned narrative threads that Games Workshop's creative teams had discarded during their endless process of refining the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Most of my work involved mundane documentation, recording the reasons why certain Space Marine color schemes were deemed unsuitable, why particular characters were removed from official canon, why specific storylines were abandoned in favor of more marketable alternatives. The archival vault where I conducted my research stretched across 3 sublevels beneath the Tower of Hegemon, each level containing millions of data cores, physical prototypes, and manuscript fragments from 40 years of continuous universe development. The deeper sections housed materials that had been classified as narratively problematic or inconsistent with established doctrine, items that contradicted the carefully maintained balance between grimdark horror and heroic fantasy that defined the franchise's commercial appeal. Section Omega 7 contained the most sensitive materials, accessible only to senior archivists with specialized clearance. I had been assigned there following my successful analysis of the abandoned Thunder Warriors Return storyline, which had been cancelled after market research indicated that audiences weren't ready for stories that questioned the Emperor's methods or revealed the systematic elimination of obsolete super soldiers. The Steel Confessors materials were stored in a magnetically sealed container, marked with warning seals that I had never seen before. The classification codes indicated that the contents had been removed from all official databases and marked for permanent concealment rather than simple archival storage. According to the access logs, only 3 individuals had examined these materials since their placement 20 years earlier. The container held 47 prototype miniatures, 3 complete army books in various stages of development, 17 pieces of artwork depicting Steel Confessors' activities, and most disturbing of all, a complete narrative outline that revealed why the chapter had been created and why their existence had become so problematic that every trace of them was systematically eliminated from official continuity. The miniatures themselves were immediately striking in their attention to detail and thematic sophistication. Unlike the standard heroic proportions that characterized most Space Marine designs, the Steel Confessors bore visible signs of psychological trauma and moral compromise. Their armor was decorated not with triumphant battle honors, but with penitential markings, confession seals, and symbols of guilt rather than glory. Brother Sergeant Matthias Caney, according to the accompanying documentation, served as the chapter's primary character representative. His miniature depicted a Space Marine whose perfect physique couldn't disguise the haunted expression visible through his helmet's optical lenses. His left shoulder pad bore the chapter's symbol, a steel cross wrapped in chains, while his right displayed not a company marking, but a tally of civilian deaths for which he had accepted responsibility. The chapter's color scheme deviated dramatically from the bright, heroic palettes that characterized successful Space Marine factions. Deep grays and steel blues dominated their armor, broken by blood-red confession seals and stark white purity markings that had been deliberately scarred and defaced. These were not triumphant warriors celebrating their victories. They were soldiers bearing visible proof of moral wounds that could never fully heal. Captain Jeremiah Cross, the chapter master's primary lieutenant according to the law documents, carried a weapon that violated several established design principles. His chainsword bore etched records of every enemy he had killed, including detailed classifications of whether each death had been justified according to Imperial doctrine. The weapon had become so heavy with accumulated guilt markings that its wielder required enhanced servo assistance to use it effectively in combat. But it was the background lore that truly revealed why the Steel Confessors had become so problematic. Unlike other Space Marine chapters that focused on external enemies and glorious victories against the darkness, the Steel Confessors' defining characteristic was their absolute commitment to confronting the moral compromises that Imperial service demanded. They maintained detailed records of every civilian casualty, every questionable order, every tactical decision that prioritized strategic objectives over human lives. The chapter's fortress monastery, designated as the Iron Penitent, was described not as a symbol of military might, but as a massive confession chamber where Space Marines came to acknowledge their failures and seek absolution for necessary but morally compromising acts. The facility contained archives that documented 20,000 years of Imperial military actions from the perspective of soldiers who recognized the human cost of their duty rather than celebrating tactical effectiveness. Their recruitment practices violated several fundamental assumptions about Space Marine psychology and conditioning. Rather than selecting candidates based on combat potential and psychological resilience, the Steel Confessors specifically sought individuals who demonstrated excessive empathy, moral sensitivity, and inability to compartmentalize the emotional consequences of violence. They wanted Marines who would never become comfortable with the brutal necessities of Imperial service. The chapter's training regimen included mandatory confession sessions where neophytes were required to acknowledge every doubt, every moment of hesitation, every instance where their conscience conflicted with their orders. Rather than eliminating these human responses through conditioning, the Steel Confessors cultivated them as essential elements of moral warfare. They believed that soldiers who lost their capacity for moral suffering had become more dangerous to humanity than the enemies they fought. Their combat doctrine reflected this philosophy in ways that would have horrified other chapters and certainly confused players accustomed to straightforward military fantasy. Steel Confessors units included embedded confessors whose tactical role was not providing spiritual inspiration, but documenting the moral costs of each engagement. Every battle included detailed casualty assessments that distinguished between necessary tactical casualties and deaths that could have been prevented through alternative approaches. The chapter maintained a unique relationship with the Imperial Guard regiments they supported. Rather than treating baseline humans as expendable resources, Steel Confessors protected guard formations with fanatical dedication, accepting higher casualties among their own ranks rather than sacrificing ordinary soldiers to preserve Space Marine lives. This inversion of standard Imperial military doctrine had created significant tensions with other Adeptus Astartes formations and Ministorum officials. Most problematic from an organizational perspective was the chapter's approach to faith and duty. While other Space Marines reconciled their loyalty to the Emperor with their tactical necessities through simple compartmentalization, the Steel Confessors insisted on confronting the contradictions directly. They acknowledged that Imperial service required moral compromises, accepted that defending humanity sometimes demanded inhuman actions, but refused to pretend that such necessities didn't carry spiritual costs. The chapter's chaplains served not as spiritual warriors, but as psychological counselors helping their brothers process the emotional trauma of perpetual warfare. They led confession sessions where Space Marines admitted their doubts about Imperial doctrine, questioned orders that seemed to contradict the Emperor's supposed benevolence, and struggled with the growing realization that their service might be perpetuating the very suffering they had sworn to eliminate. Brother Librarian Ezekiel Mordian, according to his character description, possessed psychic abilities that allowed him to sense the emotional state of civilian populations in combat zones. His talent forced him to experience the terror, despair, and hopelessness that Imperial military actions created among the people they claimed to protect. Rather than considering this a weakness to be overcome, the Steel Confessors treated Mordian's empathic suffering as sacred insight into the true cost of their duty. The chapter's relationship with other Imperial institutions was described as increasingly strained. Inquisitors found their absolute honesty about tactical failures and moral compromises deeply unsettling. Commissars reported that Steel Confessors influenced guard units to question orders and prioritize civilian welfare over military efficiency. Other Space Marine chapters avoided joint operations because the Steel Confessors' approach to warfare made their own moral compromises uncomfortably visible. As I read through the developmental notes, the reason for the chapter's cancellation became increasingly clear. The Steel Confessors represented everything that Games Workshop's marketing department had identified as problematic for maintaining broad audience appeal. They transformed heroic space knights into psychologically realistic soldiers, grappling with the moral costs of perpetual warfare. They made explicit the contradictions between Imperial propaganda and Imperial necessity that most successful fiction carefully avoided examining. The narrative documents revealed that the Steel Confessors had been designed as protagonists for a story arc exploring the psychological toll of Space Marine service on individuals who retain their essential humanity despite genetic and psychological conditioning. The storyline would have followed the chapter's growing realization that Imperial victory might require them to become the very monsters they had been created to fight against. Focus group testing had revealed that audiences found the Steel Confessors too depressing and not fun to play. Market research indicated that customers wanted Space Marines who could serve as power fantasies rather than psychological case studies. The moral complexity that made the Steel Confessors narratively interesting made them commercially unviable in a market that preferred clear distinctions between heroic protagonists and evil antagonists. But the materials also contained evidence that the creative team had fought hard to preserve at least some elements of the Steel Confessors concept. Alternate versions presented the chapter as traditional heroes who struggled with doubt but ultimately transcended their moral concerns through faith and duty. Simplified iterations removed the confession mechanics and psychological trauma, focusing instead on their dedication to protecting innocent civilians. None of these compromises had satisfied the corporate executives who made final decisions about product development. The Steel Confessors contained narrative DNA that fundamentally challenged the optimistic tone that management wanted to maintain. Even simplified versions raised uncomfortable questions about Imperial doctrine and Space Marine psychology that marketing research indicated would reduce sales among key demographic targets. The final documents in the collection contained the official termination order and instructions for complete removal of all Steel Confessors materials from corporate databases. Every miniature was to be destroyed, every piece of artwork was to be incinerated, every narrative fragment was to be deleted from development servers. The chapter would be erased so completely that future creative teams would never accidentally rediscover concepts that had been deemed too dangerous for public consumption. But someone had saved these materials, hidden them in the deepest archives where they could survive corporate purging. The access logs indicated that senior personnel had deliberately preserved evidence of what they considered an important creative achievement, even though its commercial failure had been predetermined by institutional requirements for marketable optimism. As I finished reviewing the initial materials, I realized that I had discovered more than just an interesting footnote in corporate development history. The Steel Confessors represented a road not taken, a glimpse of what Warhammer 40,000 could have become if commercial considerations hadn't required the systematic elimination of narratives that explored moral complexity rather than simple heroic fantasy. Chapter 2. The Design Documents. The second data core contained the complete design philosophy documents that revealed how the Steel Confessors had originated within Games Workshop's creative team during the mid-2000s period, when the company was experimenting with darker, more psychologically realistic approaches to Space Marine lore. The project had been initiated by senior designer Malcolm Hendricks, whose previous work on Chaos Space Marine psychology had demonstrated his ability to explore the human elements underlying superhuman warriors. Hendrix's initial design brief outlined a fundamental challenge that had been troubling the creative team: how to reconcile the heroic fantasy elements that made Space Marines appealing to players with the grimdark horror that defined the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Traditional approaches solved this problem by compartmentalizing heroism and horror. Space Marines could be noble protagonists fighting clearly evil enemies without confronting the moral implications of serving a brutal totalitarian regime. The Steel Confessors represented an attempt to address this contradiction directly, rather than avoiding it through narrative separation. Rather than creating Space Marines who somehow remained untainted by Imperial brutality, Hendrix proposed exploring what would happen to genetically enhanced super soldiers who retained sufficient humanity to recognize the moral costs of their service. The fundamental question, according to Hendrix notes, is whether Space Marines can remain recognizably human while performing inhuman duties, or whether the Imperial system necessarily transforms its protectors into monsters, regardless of their original intentions. The Steel Confessors would explore this transformation through characters who fought against their own dehumanization. The design team had consulted military psychologists and veterans counselors to understand how real-world soldiers process the trauma of combat and the moral injuries that resulted from necessary but ethically problematic actions. These consultations had revealed that many veterans struggled not with enemy contact, but with the gradual realization that effective military service required them to suppress empathy, ignore civilian casualties, and prioritize tactical objectives over human considerations. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in combat stress and moral injury, had provided detailed analysis of how highly trained professional soldiers maintained psychological stability while performing duties that conflicted with their moral frameworks. Her research suggested that successful warriors typically developed sophisticated compartmentalization mechanisms that allowed them to separate their tactical roles from their personal ethical beliefs. The Steel Confessors concept deliberately inverted this psychological model. Rather than helping Space Marines compartmentalize their moral concerns, the chapter's training would integrate ethical considerations into tactical decision-making. Instead of becoming more efficient by suppressing empathy, Steel Confessors would become more effective by maintaining their emotional connection to the human cost of warfare. This approach required completely reimagining Space Marine psychological conditioning. Traditional Adeptus Astartes training eliminated fear, doubt, and hesitation through systematic desensitization and indoctrination. The Steel Confessors would undergo conditioning that enhanced rather than suppressed their emotional responses, making them more rather than less sensitive to the suffering their actions caused. The chapter's recruitment criteria reflected this philosophical foundation. While other chapters selected candidates based on aggression, physical prowess, and psychological resilience, the Steel Confessors specifically sought individuals who demonstrated excessive empathy, moral sensitivity, and difficulty reconciling violence with their personal ethical frameworks. They wanted Marines who would never become comfortable with the brutal necessities of Imperial service. Brother candidate Alexios Thorn, according to the character development notes, exemplified the ideal Steel Confessors recruit. Orphaned during an Orc invasion that killed his entire family, Thorn had demonstrated remarkable combat potential during the planetary defense. But rather than celebrating his effectiveness in battle, he had been found weeping over the bodies of Orc casualties, trying to understand what drove the aliens to such destructive behavior. Traditional Space Marine recruitment would have either rejected Thorn for excessive emotional instability or conditioned him to eliminate such weakness. The Steel Confessors saw his empathic responses as exactly the quality they needed to preserve. They wanted Marines who could kill efficiently when necessary, but would never stop recognizing the human or inhuman cost of their actions. The chapter's training regimen included elements that would have horrified other Adeptus Astartes formations. Neophytes underwent empathy conditioning, where they were required to understand the perspectives of their enemies, the civilians caught in combat zones, and the Imperial officials whose orders they carried out. Rather than dehumanizing their opponents, Steel Confessors learned to recognize the complex motivations and circumstances that drove conflict. Advanced training included mandatory service in civilian protection roles, where Marines experienced firsthand the consequences of Imperial military actions on ordinary human populations. They worked in refugee camps, assisted with disaster relief operations, and participated in reconstruction efforts that exposed them to the long-term effects of warfare on the societies they claimed to protect. Most controversial was the chapter's approach to Imperial doctrine and religious instruction. While other Space Marines learned to accept Imperial truth through faith and conditioning, Steel Confessors were encouraged to question, analyze, and critically examine the contradictions inherent in their service. They studied alternative interpretations of the Emperor's teachings, explored the historical development of Imperial institutions, and developed personal philosophical frameworks for reconciling their duty with their conscience. Chaplain Mordecai Grimm, the chapter's spiritual leader according to the design documents, served not as a traditional warrior priest, but as a philosophical counselor, helping Marines navigate moral complexity. His sermons addressed themes like the burden of necessary evil, serving humanity while preserving humanity, and faith that questions rather than accepts. The chapter's combat doctrine reflected their philosophical approach through tactical innovations that prioritize civilian protection and enemy rehabilitation over simple destruction. Steel Confessors units included embedded counselors, whose role was documenting the psychological impact of combat operations on all participants, Marines, enemies, and civilians. Every engagement generated detailed moral impact assessments that influenced future tactical planning. Their weapons and equipment had been modified to support non-lethal resolution of conflicts whenever possible. Steel Confessors carried specialized stunning weapons, restraint systems, and communication devices designed to facilitate negotiation rather than immediate destruction. They approached each combat situation with the assumption that violence should be the last resort, rather than the preferred solution. The chapter maintained detailed archives documenting every combat action from multiple perspectives. Beyond traditional tactical analysis, these records included psychological profiles of enemy combatants, civilian casualty assessments, and long-term impact studies of their military interventions. Steel Confessors wanted to understand not just whether their actions were tactically successful, but whether they truly served the greater good. Their relationship with Imperial Guard formations had been designed to challenge traditional Space Marine attitudes toward baseline humans. Rather than treating Guard regiments as expendable resources, Steel Confessors integrated closely with human units, sharing intelligence, coordinating tactics, and accepting higher casualties among their own ranks to preserve ordinary soldiers' lives. This approach created significant tensions with other Imperial institutions. Inquisitors reported that Steel Confessors questioned orders that seemed to prioritize symbolic victories over practical benefits. Commissars noted that Guard units who served alongside the chapter developed problematic tendencies toward independent thinking and moral evaluation of their missions. The design documents included extensive artwork depicting Steel Confessors in various scenarios that illustrated their unique approach to warfare. Unlike typical Space Marine art that showed triumphant warriors standing over defeated enemies, these pieces focused on moments of moral complexity. A Marine providing medical aid to wounded civilians, while his brothers engaged enemy forces in the background. A chaplain conducting funeral rites for both Imperial and enemy casualties. A captain refusing orders that would require sacrificing innocent lives for tactical advantage. One particularly striking piece showed Brother Sergeant Caney standing in the ruins of a hive city, surrounded by refugee families, while artillery explosions illuminated the horizon. His posture conveyed not triumphant victory, but the weight of responsibility for protecting people who had lost everything because of the conflict he was fighting. The image caption read, "Victory is not conquest. It is the preservation of what makes conquest worthwhile." The chapter's fortress monastery, the Iron Penitent, had been conceived as a unique architectural statement about the nature of Space Marine service. Unlike traditional fortress designs that emphasized military might and intimidating grandeur, the Iron Penitent was built around confession chambers, memorial halls, and contemplation spaces where Marines could process the emotional costs of their duty. The facility's central feature was the Hall of Weights, where Space Marines conducted daily meditation on the moral burden of their actions. Each Marine maintained a personal shrine documenting their failures, doubts, and moral compromises, alongside their tactical achievements and service honors. The hall served as a constant reminder that heroism carried spiritual costs that must be acknowledged rather than ignored. Advanced training facilities within the monastery included realistic civilian environments where Marines practiced protection and evacuation procedures. Mock villages populated by servitor civilians allowed Steel Confessors to train for urban warfare scenarios, where minimizing collateral damage was the primary tactical objective rather than simply eliminating enemy resistance. The chapter's relationship with other Space Marine formations had been carefully developed to illustrate the tensions their approach would create within the broader Adeptus Astartes. Ultramarines found their questioning of Imperial doctrine disturbing and potentially heretical. Blood Angels worried that excessive empathy would compromise combat effectiveness. Imperial Fists considered their moral complexity a form of weakness that endangered mission success. Joint operations between Steel Confessors and other chapters would have provided opportunities to explore fundamental philosophical differences about the nature of Space Marine service. These conflicts weren't meant to demonize traditional approaches, but to examine the costs and benefits of different psychological models for superhuman warriors. The design documents also contained detailed rules mechanics that would have translated the chapter's philosophy into gameplay elements. Players would need to balance tactical effectiveness against moral costs, making strategic decisions based on long-term consequences rather than immediate advantages. Victory conditions would include civilian protection objectives and post-conflict reconstruction requirements alongside traditional combat goals. But perhaps most revealing were the focus group reports attached to these design documents. Players consistently responded negatively to the moral complexity that defined Steel Confessors' gameplay. They wanted clear objectives with measurable success criteria, not ethical dilemmas that required weighing competing values. The sophisticated narrative elements that made the chapter interesting to the design team made them commercially unviable for the target market. The documents concluded with Hendrix's final assessment of the project. "We created something beautiful and true about the human cost of heroism, but truth doesn't sell miniatures. Players want to be heroes, not philosophers. They want to win battles, not question whether winning is worth the price." This fundamental tension between narrative sophistication and commercial viability would ultimately determine the Steel Confessors' fate, but the design documents preserved evidence of what could have been a Space Marine chapter that honored both the grimdark setting's moral complexity and the human elements that made such complexity meaningful. Chapter 3: The Prototype Models. The third storage container held the complete collection of Steel Confessors' prototype miniatures, each one representing months of development work by Games Workshop's most talented sculptors and painters. Unlike the standardized heroic proportions that characterize successful Space Marine product lines, these models bore visible evidence of the psychological weight their lore described, creating an aesthetic that was simultaneously beautiful and deeply unsettling. Master sculptor Elena Vasquez had led the miniatures development team, bringing 15 years of experience creating iconic Warhammer 40,000 characters to the challenge of translating psychological complexity into physical form. Her development notes, included with each prototype, revealed the careful attention to detail that had gone into depicting Space Marines who carried moral burdens alongside their weapons and equipment. Brother Sergeant Matthias Caney served as the chapter's primary character model, and his miniature immediately demonstrated how radically different the Steel Confessors' visual approach was from established Space Marine aesthetics. Rather than the confident, aggressive posture typical of Adeptus Astartes warriors, Caney was sculpted in a moment of contemplative reflection, his bolter lowered while he examined a civilian ID card recovered from battlefield debris. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Caney's armor bore visible battle damage, but the scarring patterns told stories of defensive rather than aggressive actions. blast marks concentrated around his shield generator suggested countless hours spent protecting others rather than seeking personal glory. His helmet was designed with enhanced optical sensors optimized for civilian detection rather than target acquisition, emphasizing protection over destruction. Most striking were the confession seals that covered his armor's surface. Unlike the purity seals worn by other Space Marines, which typically celebrated victories or proclaimed faith, Kaney's seals documented failures, doubts, and moral compromises. Each seal bore microscopic text describing specific incidents where his actions had caused unintended harm or where better choices might have produced less tragic outcomes. His left shoulder pad displayed the chapter's symbol with heartbreaking clarity. The steel cross wrapped in chains wasn't a triumphant religious icon, but a representation of faith constrained by reality, idealism bound by necessity. The chains bore tiny inscriptions listing the names of civilians who had died despite Kaney's efforts to protect them, transforming his armor into a mobile memorial for his failures rather than a celebration of his successes. Captain Jeremiah Cross represented the chapter's leadership aesthetic, and his model challenged every assumption about Space Marine Command presence. Rather than radiating authority through intimidating size and elaborate decorations, Cross conveyed leadership through visible burden and moral weight. His posture suggested someone carrying responsibilities that were breaking him slowly, but which he refused to abandon. Cross's armor incorporated unique design elements that reflected the Steel Confessors' approach to warfare. His helmet included enhanced audio sensors designed to detect civilian voices in combat zones, allowing him to prioritize rescue operations over tactical objectives. His gauntlets were modified with medical diagnostics equipment, enabling him to provide emergency care to wounded non-combatants during active engagements. The captain's signature weapon, a chainsword designated Burden's Edge, represented one of the most sophisticated pieces of miniature engineering in the entire collection. The blade's surface was covered with microscopic etchings documenting every life Cross had taken, including detailed analysis of whether each death had been justified according to Imperial doctrine, personal conscience, and tactical necessity. The weapon had become so heavy with accumulated guilt markings that Cross required enhanced servo assistance to wield it effectively. His armor's power pack had been modified to support the additional weight, but the strain was visible in the slight forward lean of his posture. He carried his moral burden literally as well as figuratively, and the physical cost was carved into the miniature's stance. Brother Chaplain Mordecai Grimm challenged every visual convention associated with Space Marine spiritual leadership. Instead of the triumphant warrior priest aesthetic typical of chaplain models, Grimm was sculpted as a counselor and confessor whose authority came from wisdom rather than intimidation. His Crozius Arcanum bore symbols of healing and redemption rather than punishment and wrath. Grimm's armor incorporated confessional imagery that transformed him into a walking chapel for moral reflection. His chest plate featured a detailed relief sculpture of the Emperor, not as a triumphant god-king, but as a compassionate father grieving for humanity's suffering. His backpack housed a portable shrine where Marines could conduct emergency confession sessions during extended campaigns. The chaplain's skull mask, traditionally designed to intimidate enemies and inspire allies, had been modified to convey sorrow rather than menace. The eye sockets wept perpetual tears, represented by tiny metallic drops, while the jaw was sculpted in an expression of mourning rather than anger. Grimm appeared more like a priest conducting a funeral than a warrior preparing for battle. Brother Librarian Ezekiel Mordian represented the chapter's approach to psychic warfare, and his model illustrated how the Steel Confessors would have integrated supernatural abilities with their moral philosophy. Rather than the typical force weapon and psychic hood combination, Mordian carried specialized equipment designed for protection and healing rather than destruction and domination. Mordian's psychic focus took the form of an empathy amplifier that allowed him to experience the emotional states of everyone within combat range, allies, enemies, and civilians alike. The device was sculpted as a crown of thorns wrapped around his helmet, each thorn representing a different consciousness that he carried within his own mind. The physical pain of wearing such a device was evident in the tension visible around his eyes. His armor incorporated unique psychic dampeners designed to prevent his emotional suffering from affecting his tactical performance. The dampeners were sculpted as ornate prayer wheels that rotated slowly, each revolution representing another attempt to process the psychological weight of his empathic abilities. The visual effect suggested constant internal struggle rather than confident mastery of supernatural powers. The rank-and-file Steel Confessors demonstrated how the chapter's philosophy would have been implemented at every level of their organization. Battle Brother Marcus Thorn carried standard bolter and chainsword, but both weapons had been modified with non-lethal alternatives. His bolter could fire stunning rounds designed to incapacitate rather than kill, while his chainsword incorporated neural disruptors that could disable enemies without permanent injury. Thorn's armor bore visible evidence of his recruitment background. Faded gang colors showed through the Steel Confessors livery, representing his transition from criminal violence to redemptive service. His helmet retained personal decoration from his pre-Marine life, a small flower painted by a sister killed in the gang warfare that had eventually led to his recruitment. The model's base included debris from an urban environment where civilian casualties were clearly visible. Thorn was positioned protecting a wounded child while engaging enemy forces, his stance suggesting someone fighting defensively rather than aggressively. The scene challenged players to consider whether military victory was meaningful if it failed to preserve innocent life. Apothecary Caleb Voss represented the chapter's approach to medical support, extending their protective philosophy to post-combat care and recovery. Unlike traditional apothecary models focused on battlefield surgery and gene seed recovery, Voss was equipped for comprehensive trauma care, including psychological counseling and long-term rehabilitation support. His medical equipment included devices for treating civilian casualties alongside Space Marine injuries. His armor incorporated enlarged medical storage compartments and enhanced life support systems designed to sustain critically wounded non-combatants during evacuation procedures. The model suggested someone who viewed healing as equally important to warfare. Voss's personal modifications included empathy enhancers that allowed him to better understand his patient's psychological state and provide appropriate emotional support alongside physical treatment. His helmet displayed vital signs from multiple patients simultaneously, enabling him to prioritize care based on suffering rather than strategic importance. Tech Marine Josiah Kane challenged traditional assumptions about the relationship between technology and humanity within Space Marine culture. Rather than the typical aesthetic of mechanical augmentation overwhelming human elements, Kane's modifications were designed to enhance his empathy and moral sensitivity, rather than replacing them with cold efficiency. Kane's servo skull familiars were programmed for civilian rescue and support operations rather than combat assistance. They carried medical supplies, communication equipment, and recording devices designed to document the human cost of warfare rather than simply providing tactical intelligence. The skulls retained human facial features, serving as reminders of individual identity rather than symbols of mechanized dehumanization. His armor incorporated unique machine spirit interfaces that allowed him to commune with vehicle spirits about the moral implications of their service. Kane could access the accumulated memories of Imperial vehicles, learning from their perspectives about the long-term consequences of military actions. This capability made him an invaluable advisor for tactical planning that considered ethical factors alongside strategic objectives. The vehicle prototypes included in the collection demonstrated how Steel Confessors' philosophy would have influenced their mechanical support. A modified Rhino transport incorporated enhanced life support systems and medical facilities designed for civilian evacuation operations. The vehicle's armor was configured to provide maximum protection for passengers, rather than offensive capability. The Steel Confessors' dreadnought represented perhaps the most tragic element of the collection. Brother Sarion the Contemplative had been entombed not because of physical wounds, but because of psychological trauma so severe that only the mechanical support of dreadnought systems could sustain his damaged mind. His sarcophagus was sculpted with imagery of suffering rather than victory, depicting a warrior who had been broken by the moral weight of 10,000 years of service. The painting schemes applied to each prototype demonstrated how the chapter's visual identity would have differed from successful Space Marine factions. Deep greys and steel blues created a somber, reflective appearance rather than the bright, heroic colors that tested well with focus groups. Blood red confession seals provided color contrast, while emphasizing sacrifice and suffering rather than triumph and glory. But perhaps, most significantly, every miniature included visible civilian elements that challenged players to consider the human context of Space Marine warfare. Small details like carried photographs, civilian clothing fragments, or improvised memorials forced viewers to confront the broader consequences of military actions rather than focusing solely on tactical outcomes. The collection represented thousands of hours of artistic development and technical innovation, creating some of the most sophisticated and emotionally complex miniatures in Games Workshop's history. But focus group testing had consistently revealed that players found the models too depressing, not fun to play with, and too complicated for straightforward gaming experiences. The aesthetic sophistication that made the Steel Confessors fascinating to artists and narrative designers made them commercially unviable for a market that preferred clear moral distinctions and uncomplicated heroic fantasy. Beauty and truth, it seemed, were less marketable than simplicity and wish fulfillment. Chapter 4. The Hidden Narratives. The fourth archive section contained complete narrative outlines for the Steel Confessors' planned introduction to official Warhammer 40,000 canon, revealing story arcs that would have fundamentally challenged established assumptions about Space Marine psychology, Imperial doctrine, and the moral framework underlying the entire setting. These weren't simple character backgrounds or battle histories. They were sophisticated explorations of philosophical themes that questioned the very foundation of the universe's grimdark appeal. Lead writer Marcus Holloway had crafted the Steel Confessors' primary narrative around a central question that had been troubling the creative team for years. How could Space Marines serve the Imperium's brutal totalitarian system while maintaining any recognizable humanity? Previous approaches had either ignored this contradiction or resolved it through compartmentalization. Marines were heroes when fighting aliens and monsters, servants of necessity when implementing Imperial policy. The Steel Confessor stories would have confronted this contradiction directly through characters who possessed both the power to shape events and the moral sensitivity to recognize the consequences of their choices. Rather than providing easy answers, the narratives explored the psychological cost of trying to serve humanity while preserving one's essential humanity within a system designed to eliminate such concerns. The Burden of Angels, the chapter's introductory novel, would have followed Captain Jeremiah Cross during his first command assignment, a counterinsurgency operation on the agri-world Thessaly Prime, where Chaos cultists had infiltrated the planetary government. Traditional Space Marine stories would have focused on identifying and eliminating the cultist threat through decisive military action. Cross's story explored what happened when the cultists turned out to be desperate farmers driven to heretical desperation by Imperial taxation policies that were slowly starving their families. The opening chapters established Cross as a newly promoted officer, eager to prove himself worthy of his enhanced genetics and advanced training. His initial briefings portrayed the Thessaly situation in traditional terms: loyal Imperial citizens threatened by dangerous heretics who required immediate military intervention. Cross approached the deployment with confidence in his ability to distinguish between innocent civilians and corrupted enemies. But the first combat encounter shattered these simple assumptions. The cultists Cross confronted were emaciated farmers armed with improvised weapons, chanting prayers to Nurgle, not out of genuine devotion, but because they believed the plague god might provide food for their starving children. Their heretical rituals involved desperate attempts to improve crop yields through any supernatural assistance they could access. Cross found himself facing an impossible choice: follow Imperial doctrine and eliminate the cultists as required by his orders, or investigate the underlying conditions that had driven loyal citizens to such desperate measures. His Steel Confessors training compelled him to choose the more complex path, leading to discoveries about Imperial administrative corruption that traditional Space Marine conditioning would have prevented him from recognizing. The investigation revealed that Thessaly Prime's agricultural output was being diverted to support military campaigns in neighboring systems, leaving insufficient food for the local population. Imperial tax collectors were demanding increased production quotas despite declining soil quality and inadequate equipment maintenance. Planetary officials were skimming resources for personal enrichment while reporting successful compliance with Imperial requirements. Cross's dilemma intensified when he realized that exposing the corruption would destabilize the entire planetary government at a time when military rebellion was already straining Imperial authority throughout the sector. Allowing the corruption to continue meant condemning innocent civilians to starvation and heretical desperation. But intervening would require him to act against Imperial officials, whose authority derived from the same system that granted his own legitimacy. Traditional Space Marine doctrine provided clear guidance. Eliminate immediate threats to Imperial stability and leave administrative concerns to appropriate civilian authorities. Cross's Steel Confessors conditioning demanded that he consider the moral implications of his choices rather than simply following predetermined protocols. The narrative's central conflict emerged when Cross decided to provide covert assistance to the farmers while publicly maintaining his mission to eliminate cultist threats. He used his chapter's resources to investigate the corruption network, gathering evidence that could be presented to higher Imperial authorities while simultaneously working to address the immediate humanitarian crisis. This approach required Cross to deceive his own superiors, manipulate Imperial administrative systems, and coordinate with civilian rebels whose actions technically constituted heresy against established authority. Every decision compromised his formal duty while advancing his moral obligation to protect innocent life. The story's climax came when Cross was forced to choose between two equally unacceptable alternatives: allow a corrupt Imperial governor to execute the farmer cultists as an example to other potential rebels, or reveal his unauthorized investigation and risk court-martial for exceeding his authority. His choice to intervene publicly set up the broader themes that would have defined Steel Confessors' narratives going forward. The Weight of Conscience, the planned follow-up novel, would have explored how Cross's actions on Thessaly Prime affected his relationship with the broader Imperial hierarchy. Rather than celebrating his successful resolution of the crisis, Inquisitor Maximilian Vaughn launched an investigation into whether Cross's unorthodox methods indicated dangerous independence or potential corruption. The investigation itself became a meditation on the nature of loyalty and duty within Imperial service. Vaughn represented traditional approaches that prioritized institutional stability over individual conscience, viewing Cross's moral concerns as potential weaknesses that could be exploited by enemies of mankind. His interrogation techniques were designed to identify psychological vulnerabilities rather than simply determining factual guilt or innocence. Cross's defense required him to articulate a philosophy of service that balanced personal conscience with institutional loyalty, individual moral responsibility with collective security requirements. The novel would have explored these themes through detailed examination of specific decisions Cross had made, showing how moral complexity played out in practical terms rather than simply discussing abstract principles. Brother librarian Ezekiel Mordian served as Cross's advocate during the investigation, using his psychic abilities to demonstrate that the captain's empathy enhanced rather than compromised his tactical effectiveness. Mordian's empathic powers allowed him to understand the psychological state of civilian populations, providing intelligence that purely military analysis couldn't access. The investigation scenes were crafted to reveal the fundamental tensions within Imperial ideology. Vaughn's questions forced Cross to confront the contradictions between protecting humanity and serving the Imperium, between individual moral responsibility and collective security needs, between personal conscience and institutional authority. Can you serve the Emperor's will while defying the Emperor's representatives? Became the central question that defined not just Cross's personal crisis, but the philosophical challenge facing any Space Marine who retained sufficient humanity to recognize moral complexity. The novel offered no easy answers, but it provided a framework for exploring these tensions in subsequent stories. The planned trilogy's concluding volume, The Price of Angels, would have shown the Steel Confessors confronting the ultimate test of their philosophy during a campaign against Terranid Hive Fleet Erebus. Unlike previous enemies who could be understood through human motivations or corrupted human desires, the Tyranids represented pure alien hunger that threatened all biological life, regardless of moral considerations or political affiliations. The campaign would have forced the chapter to balance their protective philosophy against an enemy that could only be defeated through total warfare. Traditional Space Marine approaches emphasizing maximum destruction and acceptable casualties were tactically appropriate against Tyranids, but psychologically devastating for Marines trained to value every human life. Captain Cross, now elevated to Chapter Master following the previous leadership's death in combat, had to decide whether Steel Confessors principles could be maintained during existential warfare, or whether survival required temporary abandonment of moral constraints. The decision would have defined the chapter's future and their place within the broader Imperial military hierarchy. The Tyranid campaign was designed to test every aspect of Steel Confessors' philosophy through increasingly desperate circumstances. Early battles allowed the chapter to maintain their protective approach while achieving tactical objectives. But as the Hive Fleet's true size became apparent, traditional Imperial strategy demanded sacrificial rearguard actions and civilian population abandonment that conflicted directly with the chapter's core principles. Cross's character arc throughout the trilogy showed a gradual evolution from idealistic young captain to experienced leader who understood that moral purity was often incompatible with practical effectiveness. But rather than abandoning his principles, he developed more sophisticated approaches to balancing competing obligations. The proposed resolution involved Cross discovering that the Steel Confessors' emphasis on civilian protection actually provided tactical advantages against the Tyranids, whose psychological warfare capabilities were designed to exploit traditional Imperial disregard for non-combatant casualties. By maintaining their protective focus, the chapter avoided psychological vulnerabilities that had compromised other Imperial forces. Supporting character narratives would have explored how different Steel Confessors' specialties dealt with moral complexity in their respective roles. Chaplain Grimm's story arc involved developing new spiritual frameworks that acknowledged doubt and moral uncertainty as legitimate aspects of faith rather than weaknesses to be overcome. Brother Sergeant Caney's development focused on his evolution from individual warrior to squad leader, responsible for guiding other Marines through moral challenges. His personal growth was measured not by tactical achievements, but by his ability to help his brothers maintain their humanity while performing increasingly difficult duties. Apothecary Voss's narratives explored the medical and psychological care required to sustain Marines who were psychologically sensitive to the trauma of warfare, rather than conditioned to ignore it. His innovations in combat psychology and moral injury treatment became essential to maintaining chapter effectiveness. The broader narrative framework was designed to show how individual moral choices could influence larger institutional patterns, how personal conscience could serve strategic objectives, and how humanity could be preserved even within systems designed to eliminate it. These themes were sophisticated enough to appeal to adult readers while remaining accessible to the younger audiences that comprised Games Workshop's primary market. But focus group testing revealed that audiences found the moral complexity exhausting rather than engaging. Players wanted clear objectives and measurable success criteria, not philosophical dilemmas that required weighing competing values. The sophisticated themes that made the stories interesting to the creative team made them commercially unviable for mass market publication. The final narrative documents included detailed outlines for dozens of additional stories that would have explored Steel Confessors' interactions with other Imperial institutions, their relationships with different alien species, and their evolution as a chapter, dealing with increasing pressure to conform to standard Adeptus Astartes behavioral patterns. These stories represented some of the most sophisticated science fiction writing in Games Workshop's development history, addressing themes of moral complexity, institutional loyalty, and personal responsibility that rarely appeared in commercial gaming fiction. But their commercial failure was predetermined by market research, indicating that philosophical sophistication reduced rather than enhanced sales potential. The narratives remained archived as evidence of what Warhammer 40,000 could have become if commercial considerations hadn't required the systematic elimination of moral complexity in favor of straightforward heroic fantasy. They preserved alternative approaches to the setting that honored both its grimdark themes and its potential for exploring serious philosophical questions through science fiction adventure.